June 1944, somewhere over the Philippine Sea. A lone Hellcat pilot glanced at his fuel gauge, then at the 5 Japanese fighters circling above him like vultures. His carrier was 80 miles east, hidden beyond the curve of the earth. His wingman was gone. His radio crackled with static, and he had just made a decision that would either kill him or rewrite the rules of survival. What happens when a man chooses to fight when every calculation says run? The summer of 1944 brought a war to the Central Pacific that moved with industrial rhythm. American carrier task forces had become floating cities of steel, each one a mobile airfield capable of projecting power across thousands of miles of empty ocean. The strategic objective was clear: seize the Mariana Islands, establish bases for the new B-29 superfortress, bring the war to the Japanese home islands. But between American ambition and Japanese homeland lay the most formidable naval aviation force the Empire had assembled since Pearl Harbor. The Japanese combined fleet still possessed 9 aircraft carriers and nearly 500 aircraft. Their pilots had trained for this moment. Their doctrine centered on one decisive battle, one overwhelming strike, one chance to reverse the tide of a war they were slowly losing. The Americans knew it was coming. They called the operation Forager, the invasion of Saipan, and they understood that Japan would commit everything to stop it. By mid-June, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 had positioned itself west of the Marianas, shielding the invasion beaches while hunting for the Japanese fleet. 15 carriers, over 900 aircraft, the largest concentration of naval aviation power the world had ever seen. Yet for all that strength, the reality of carrier warfare remained intimate and terrifying. A pilot launched from a flight deck entered a world of fuel limits, navigation uncertainty, and the ever-present knowledge that his ship might be 200 miles away when his engine began to cough. The Pacific was vast and indifferent. It swallowed men who made small errors. The fighters that would decide this battle were Grumman F-6F Hellcats, tough, fast, forgiving. They had been designed specifically to kill Zeros, and they did it with mechanical efficiency. But a Hellcat still carried a pilot who bled, who feared, who watched his fuel gauge with growing anxiety. The morning of June 19, 1944, began with radar contacts, dozens of them, then hundreds. The Japanese were launching their strike. What followed would be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American fighters, guided by radar and coordinated through combat information centers, intercepted wave after wave of Japanese aircraft. The kill ratios were staggering. 300 Japanese planes destroyed in a single day. American losses were minimal, but statistics obscure the human texture of combat. Somewhere in that chaos, individual pilots found themselves alone, separated from their divisions, low on fuel, facing decisions that no doctrine could resolve. One of those pilots was about to discover what a man does when mathematics says he should die, but something else says he should fight. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. His name was Lieutenant Junior Grade Alex Vraciu. And before the war, he had been a college student in Indiana who liked football and thought flying seemed like an interesting way to serve. He was not a natural killer. He was not born with extraordinary reflexes. He was, by most measures, an ordinary young American who had stumbled into an extraordinary profession. Vraciu had joined the Navy in 1941, just months before Pearl Harbor transformed everything. He earned his wings at Corpus Christi, Texas, where instructors pushed young men through a curriculum designed to separate the capable from the dead. Flight training was brutal but systematic. You learned to land on pitching decks. You learned to navigate by dead reckoning when clouds obscured the stars. You learned that the ocean would kill you faster than any enemy if you made stupid decisions. What training could not teach was temperament under fire. Some men froze, some panicked, some developed a cold clarity that allowed them to function when chaos reigned. Vraciu belonged to the third category, though he would not have described himself that way. He simply did what seemed logical in the moment. His first combat had come in late 1943, flying from the USS Independence during the Gilbert Islands campaign. The learning curve was vertical. Japanese pilots were experienced, their Zeros were nimble, and the ocean did not care about American confidence. Vraciu watched friends die. He learned that survival required discipline, situational awareness, and the humility to admit what you did not know. By early 1944, he had transferred to Air Group 6 aboard the USS Intrepid, flying with some of the most experienced Hellcat pilots in the fleet. These were men who had survived the brutal attrition of 1942 and 1943, who understood that aggression without judgment was suicide. Vraciu absorbed their lessons. He learned to conserve fuel obsessively. He learned to check his six constantly. He learned that the enemy you did not see was the one who killed you. And he learned that a damaged aircraft 80 miles from home was a coffin waiting to close. The Hellcat he flew was a machine designed for his survival. Its radial engine could absorb punishment that would destroy lesser aircraft. Its armor protected the pilot from rounds that would have killed him in earlier fighters. Its 6 .50-caliber machine guns could shred an enemy aircraft in a 2-second burst. But none of that mattered if you ran out of fuel over empty ocean. By June 1944, Vraciu had already claimed kills. He understood the mechanics of aerial combat, but understanding and experience were different things. The Marianas would test everything he thought he knew. On the morning of June 19th, he launched from Intrepid as part of a combat air patrol, climbing to altitude and orbiting west of the task force. The fighter direction officers were already vectoring divisions toward incoming threats. The radio was alive with contacts, warnings, and the controlled urgency of men doing their jobs under pressure. Vraciu's division initially stayed together. Then contacts multiplied. Then the division scattered to engage separate threats. Then Vraciu found himself alone at 20,000 feet, his wingman lost in the chaos, his fuel gauge showing consumption that meant he had maybe 90 minutes before decisions became prayers. This was the moment that separated the lucky from the skilled. Vraciu chose to stay in the fight. The tactical problem facing Vraciu was the same problem facing every carrier pilot who found himself separated from his formation. He was alone in a three-dimensional battlefield where the enemy could appear from any angle, where his own aircraft was both weapon and prison, and where the nearest friendly deck was a mathematical abstraction that might as well have been the moon. Standard doctrine said a lone pilot should attempt to rejoin friendly aircraft or return to the task force. Engaging multiple enemies without support was discouraged for good reason. The physics of air combat favored numbers. A single pilot, no matter how skilled, could not cover his own blind spots. He could not divide enemy attention. He could not recover from a mistake that left him slow, low, or out of position. But doctrine assumed conditions that rarely existed in actual combat. Vraciu could not find his division. He could see Japanese aircraft everywhere, and retreating east meant burning fuel while accomplishing nothing. The contacts above him were 5 Japanese fighters. Their silhouettes suggested Zeros, though positive identification at distance was always uncertain. They were flying a loose formation, likely searching for the American fleet or hunting scattered pilots exactly like him. They had the altitude advantage. They had numerical superiority. They had every tactical benefit except one. Vraciu understood his aircraft. The Hellcat was heavier than the Zero. It could not turn as tightly, it could not climb as steeply at low speeds, but it could dive faster without structural failure. It could absorb damage that would disintegrate a Zero, and its engine could sustain full power longer without overheating. These advantages meant nothing if you flew like an idiot. They meant everything if you fought the way the Hellcat wanted to fight. Vraciu made a decision that was either brilliant or suicidal, and in the moment, he could not be sure which. He began climbing toward the Japanese formation. He would not wait to be bounced. He would not flee. He would force an engagement on terms that gave him any chance at all. The institutional failure this represented was subtle. American training emphasized division tactics, mutual support, and coordinated attacks. Nothing in Vraciu's schooling had prepared him for the specific situation of a lone pilot choosing to engage 5 enemies. No manual covered it. No instructor had simulated it. He was improvising in a profession where improvisation usually meant death. But Vraciu had absorbed something deeper than specific procedures. He had learned to think in terms of energy, angles, and opportunity windows. He understood that 5 aircraft flying together were not 5 independent threats, but a system with vulnerabilities. If he could disrupt their coordination, he might survive long enough to make them pay for their advantages. The Zero pilots saw him climbing. They began to react, and in their reaction, Vraciu saw his first opening. What Vraciu noticed was something his instructors had mentioned but never emphasized. Japanese formations, when threatened by a single aircraft, often committed as a group. Their doctrine emphasized collective action. Their honor culture made individual withdrawal shameful. These tendencies could be exploited by a pilot willing to bait them. The 5 Zeros began turning toward him simultaneously. They were attempting to bracket him, to cut off escape routes, to force him into an engagement where their numbers would dominate. It was textbook, it was predictable, and predictability was vulnerability. Vraciu did not continue climbing. Instead, he rolled inverted and dove directly toward the nearest Zero, building speed rapidly. The Japanese pilot saw the attack and instinctively pulled into a tight turn, doing exactly what Zero doctrine prescribed. But tight turns bled energy, and energy was survival. The other 4 Zeros followed their leader, beginning their own turns to pursue Vraciu. But they were now strung out in a loose trail, each pilot trying to acquire the diving Hellcat, each one losing the tight formation that had been their advantage moments before. Vraciu's dive carried him past the first Zero before either pilot could bring guns to bear. He pulled out hard, accepting the G-forces that grayed his vision, and reversed direction. Now he was behind the formation, momentarily, impossibly, with an angle on an enemy aircraft. The trailing Zero was still turning, still trying to reacquire Vraciu, still expecting the American to be somewhere ahead. He was wrong. Vraciu fired a burst. The Hellcat's guns were harmonized to converge at 300 yards. At that range, the pattern was devastating. 50-caliber rounds tore into the Zero's engine and wing root. The aircraft did not explode cinematically. It simply began to come apart, trailing debris and fire as its structural integrity failed. 1 down, 4 to go, fuel still bleeding away with every second. The remaining Japanese pilots realized their error. They scattered, each seeking altitude and separation, trying to reset the engagement on more favorable terms. But scattering meant they were no longer mutually supporting. Vraciu had achieved something improbable. He had disrupted their formation and created a series of one-on-one encounters. Authority, in the form of Navy doctrine, would have said this success was statistical luck. Standard tactics assumed you needed numerical parity or advantage to win. Vraciu was demonstrating that the assumption was incomplete. Skill, timing, and understanding of the enemy could substitute for numbers in specific circumstances, but he was not safe. He was alone, with 4 enemies regrouping and a fuel gauge that showed no mercy. The next minutes were the longest of Alex Vraciu's life. He had broken the formation. He had killed 1 aircraft, but he remained outnumbered, outpositioned, and running out of time. The 4 surviving Zeros were recovering above him. They were separating deliberately now, learning from their mistake, attempting to bracket him from multiple angles. If they succeeded, one of them would inevitably find a firing solution, while the others distracted him. Vraciu did not wait for them to complete their maneuver. He selected the lowest of the 4 and dove toward him, trading altitude for speed in a gamble that relied on the Hellcat's superior dive characteristics. The Zero pilot saw him coming and pushed over to accelerate away, but the Zero could not match the Hellcat's terminal velocity. Physics was not negotiable. The pursuit became a race toward the ocean. Both aircraft screamed downward, engines at maximum power, altimeters unwinding. The surface of the Philippine Sea grew from abstraction to terrifying reality. Vraciu held his dive longer than caution permitted. He closed the distance because he had to. At 400 yards, he fired. The deflection angle was difficult, the target jinking slightly, the closure rate making sustained tracking nearly impossible. But some rounds connected. The Zero began smoking. Whether it was fatal damage or manageable, Vraciu could not know. He had to break off or become a victim himself. He pulled out of the dive at dangerously low altitude, vision tunneling from the G-forces, the ocean surface a blur below him. The Zero continued down, trailing smoke, disappearing toward the water. Vraciu never saw it crash. He could not confirm the kill. He could only know that the aircraft was no longer a threat. 3 remained, maybe 2 if the smoking Zero had gone in. Vraciu climbed again, scanning constantly, aware that every second of this fight consumed fuel he could not replace. The surviving Zeros were more cautious now. They had lost 2 aircraft to a single American. They maintained distance, circling, waiting for Vraciu to make a mistake. But circling consumed their fuel too, and they had farther to fly to reach their own carriers. Vraciu understood the new mathematics. If he could survive long enough, the Japanese would be forced to disengage or risk ditching. He did not need to kill them all. He needed to outlast them. For several minutes, the engagement became a deadly waltz. The Zeros probed. Vraciu evaded. Neither side committed to a decisive pass. The altitudes varied, the distances fluctuated, but no shots were fired. Then one of the Japanese pilots made a judgment that changed everything. Perhaps he was low on ammunition. Perhaps his fuel was critical. Perhaps he simply decided that killing this stubborn American was not worth dying for. He broke away, heading west toward the distant Japanese fleet. His departure left 2 Zeros against 1 Hellcat. The odds were still against Vraciu, but they were improving. The remaining pair attempted one more coordinated attack, approaching from opposite directions to divide Vraciu's attention. It was a sound tactic. It nearly worked. Vraciu saw them coming, calculated angles and closure rates, and made an instantaneous decision. He turned into the closer threat, ignoring the more distant one, betting everything on the principle that a near enemy was more dangerous than a far one. The closer Zero tried to pull lead for a shot. Vraciu's turn was sharper than expected. The Japanese pilot overshot, his rounds passing behind the Hellcat's tail. Now Vraciu was on his wing, close enough to see the sun glinting off the canopy. He fired. At that range, missing was almost impossible. The Zero's engine disintegrated under the impact of concentrated .50 caliber fire. The aircraft pitched forward and fell toward the ocean. No fire, no explosion, just sudden mechanical death. The last Zero did not continue the fight. Its pilot had seen 3 of his companions destroyed or driven off. He banked away and dove toward the western horizon, escaping while escape was still possible. Vraciu was alone again, but this time there were no enemies circling above him. He had won. Against 5 opponents, with no support, 80 miles from his carrier, he had won. The victory felt less like triumph than relief. His hands were shaking. His fuel gauge showed a number that demanded immediate attention. The carrier was far away, and every minute mattered now. Vraciu turned east and began the long flight home, navigating by compass and dead reckoning, scanning the ocean for the wakes that would mark Task Force 58. He found them. He landed aboard Intrepid with fuel margins that would have made his instructors wince. When he climbed out of the cockpit, he held up fingers to indicate his kills for the day. The photograph taken in that moment would become one of the iconic images of the Pacific War, but in the instant itself, Vraciu was simply a tired young man who was grateful to be alive. The ripple effects of Vraciu's engagement extended far beyond one afternoon's combat. His performance during the Battle of the Philippine Sea contributed to a single-day total that made him, temporarily, the Navy's leading ace. More importantly, his survival demonstrated something that doctrine had underestimated. The combat lessons were analyzed, shared, and integrated into training. Single-pilot engagements against multiple opponents were still discouraged, but the principles Vraciu had employed became case studies. The value of energy management, the importance of disrupting enemy formations, the willingness to accept risk when the alternative was passive defeat. Statistical analysis of the Philippine Sea engagement showed that American pilots had achieved kill ratios exceeding 10-to-1 against Japanese naval aviation. The reasons were multiple. Better aircraft, better training, better radar coordination, better doctrine. But individual performance mattered too. Pilots like Vraciu had proven that the Hellcat, properly flown, could dominate the Zero in ways that seemed impossible 2 years earlier. The Japanese Naval Aviation Force never recovered from the Marianas. The losses in aircraft were replaceable. The losses in experienced pilots were not. The men who died over the Philippine Sea had been trained before the war, had accumulated hundreds of combat hours, and represented institutional knowledge that could not be quickly regenerated. American commanders understood this asymmetry. They pressed their advantage. Subsequent operations in the Philippines, at Formosa, and in the final approaches to Japan would reflect the confidence built during the Turkey Shoot. Carrier aviation had proven itself the dominant weapon of the Pacific War. For Vraciu personally, the battle marked a transition. He continued flying combat missions through the remainder of 1944, adding to his tally, refining his skills. But he also began reflecting on what he had learned about himself and about combat. The war had revealed something fundamental about human performance under pressure. Training mattered immensely. Equipment mattered immensely. But in the final moments, when doctrine failed and calculations offered no good options, something else took over. Call it instinct, call it courage, call it the stubborn refusal to accept mathematics as destiny. Vraciu had entered his engagement against 5 zeros, knowing that the numbers said he should die. He had chosen to fight anyway because retreating felt wrong, because engaging felt right, because sometimes the only logical choice is the one that logic cannot justify. That decision cost him fuel, risked his life, and violated every principle of economical combat. It also killed 3 enemy aircraft and drove off 2 others. It demonstrated that American pilots could fight and win even in the worst circumstances. And it added to the psychological collapse of Japanese naval aviation that would end the war in the Pacific. The measurable consequences included kills confirmed, tactics refined, and confidence amplified. The unmeasurable consequences included something harder to define. A young man had discovered that he was capable of more than he imagined, and that discovery would shape everything that followed. Alex Vraciu survived the war. He finished with 19 aerial victories, making him one of the top-scoring Navy aces of the conflict. He served in Korea. He remained in naval aviation for decades after, teaching new generations the lessons he had learned over the Philippine Sea. But the numbers and the service record obscure the human texture of what he experienced. For the rest of his life, Vraciu spoke about combat with the measured tone of a man who understood its costs. He did not glorify killing. He did not minimize fear. He talked about duty, about training, about the men who did not come home. The engagement against 5 Zeros remained, in his memory, less a moment of heroism than a moment of clarity. He had done what needed doing because no one else could do it. He had trusted his aircraft, his training, and his judgment. And he had survived when survival seemed improbable. The legacy of that afternoon extends beyond Vraciu himself. It lives in the doctrine that emerged from the Philippine Sea, in the training that incorporates its lessons, in the confidence that American naval aviation carries into every conflict. One pilot, alone over empty ocean, had proven that courage and skill could overcome numerical disadvantage. But the deeper legacy is philosophical. War reveals human beings to themselves. It strips away the comfortable illusions of ordinary life and exposes what remains when everything else is gone. Some men discover weakness. Some discover strength they never suspected. Vraciu discovered that the gap between impossible and improbable is smaller than it appears. 80 miles from the carrier, 5 enemies circling, no support, no backup, no margin for error. And he chose to fight. The ocean below held no answers. The sky above offered no mercy. Only the man in the cockpit could decide what happened next. And his decision echoed through decades, teaching everyone who followed that sometimes the only way home is straight through the fire.